My teacher started failing me right after my dad dumped her. Then I discovered she'd been emailing him about how I needed to be taught a lesson. This all started my junior year of high school. I was the kid who actually liked school. 3.8 GPA, college bound, the whole responsible eldest child package. My parents had divorced 2 years earlier, and dad was doing his best single-parent thing while mom lived 3 states away with her new boyfriend. Ms. Delgado taught AP English literature, and everyone said she was tough but fair. I'd heard the warnings about her red pen, but I figured hard work would pay off like it always had. My dad always said I had a gift for writing, and my sophomore English teacher had recommended me for AP specifically because of my essays. The semester started normal enough. Ms. Delgado was strict, sure, but she seemed to appreciate students who took the work seriously. I sat front row, participated in discussions, turned everything in early. Standard overachiever behavior that had always served me well in the past. That first essay came back with a B. Not terrible, but definitely lower than I was used to. The comments were vague, lacks depth, surface-level analysis, but I figured it was just the AP adjustment period everyone talks about. My sophomore teacher had warned me that junior year would be different, that teachers would expect more sophisticated thinking and college-level analysis. I doubled down on my efforts for the second assignment, spent extra time in the library researching background material, started reading literary criticism to deepen my understanding of the text we were studying, asked my dad to proofread my work before I turned it in, something I'd never needed to do before but thought might help me catch errors or unclear passages. The second essay came back with a C+. Same vague feedback about lacking depth and sophistication. Same sense that I was missing something fundamental that Ms. Delgado expected, but never quite explained in class or in her written comments. At first I brushed it off as typical junior year grade deflation. AP classes were supposed to be harder, right? Every teacher told us that. Every guidance counselor prepared us for the reality that our GPAs might take a hit as we transitioned to college-level work and higher expectations. But then I started paying attention to what was happening around me, and the picture didn't make sense. Chloe turned in her Macbeth essay the same day as mine. I'd seen her frantically writing it during lunch, asking people basic plot questions like whether Banquo actually dies, and if Lady Macbeth was really the main villain. Her essay was 3 paragraphs long and spent half a page summarizing the plot instead of analyzing it. She got a B+. The comments praised her clear understanding of character motivations and solid grasp of the text. Then there was Marcus, who openly bragged about using online study guides instead of reading the actual books. His Gatsby analysis was basically a book report with fancy vocabulary words sprinkled in like seasoning on bland chicken. He'd written about how Gatsby wanted the American dream really bad and how the green light probably meant hope or something. B+ again. Ms. Delgado had written good insights into symbolism at the top. Meanwhile, my carefully crafted comparison between Fitzgerald's symbolism and modernist poetry techniques, complete with outside sources and original insights that took me 2 weeks to develop, came back with a C+. The feedback was brutal, overambitious. Focus on the text itself rather than showing off your research abilities. I started keeping track in a notebook I kept hidden in my backpack. 5 essays in, and I hadn't scored above a B on anything. The class average was a B, which meant half the students were doing better than me, with what I could see was significantly less effort and lower quality work. Ava Kim consistently turned in essays that were barely the minimum word count, full of basic observations that sounded like she'd skimmed the book the night before. She wrote about Hamlet being confused about what to do, and called Ophelia kind of crazy but also sad. She was pulling solid Bs every time, with comments like good emotional understanding of the characters. Logan had a habit of confusing character names and plot points. In his Pride and Prejudice essay, he'd referred to Elizabeth Bennet as the main girl who doesn't like the rich guy at first, and had somehow mixed up Mr. Darcy with Mr. Wickham in his analysis. B with a note about creative interpretation. Creative? I was losing my mind. These weren't just slightly different perspectives or writing styles. These were objectively weaker essays getting significantly better grades than mine. Then Ms. Delgado announced she was starting an after-school writing workshop for students who needed extra support. She looked directly at me when she said it, her eyes lingering on my face like she was delivering a personal message. Me, the kid who'd been writing for the school newspaper since freshman year and had won 3 regional writing contests. I'll be offering individual feedback sessions to help struggling writers develop their voice, she continued, still looking in my direction. Sometimes students who've received praise in the past need to learn that high school success doesn't automatically translate to college-level work. The words hit like a slap. I'd never been called a struggling writer in my life. English had always been my strongest subject, my safe space, the thing I could count on when math got hard or science felt overwhelming. But here's what really caught my attention. She didn't invite Marcus, whose last essay had concluded that Jay Gatsby was basically just a rich guy who threw parties and died because of it. She didn't invite Logan, who consistently misspelled character names and had once referred to Elizabeth Bennet as the main girl from that old book about dancing and marriage. She didn't invite Ava, whose idea of literary analysis was describing characters as nice or mean, and whose understanding of themes rarely went deeper than love is important or money can't buy happiness. She invited me, and 2 other students whose work I'd actually seen and respected, kids who were clearly putting in effort and producing thoughtful analysis, but who were also struggling with Ms. Delgado's grading standards. The workshop was awkward from day one. Ms. Delgado would hover over my shoulder while I wrote, making comments about my tendency toward pretentious language and my inability to connect with the average reader. She'd point out sentences and ask me to explain why I'd chosen specific words, then shake her head when I gave my reasoning. This is what I mean, she'd say to the group. Sometimes students get so caught up in sounding intellectual that they forget the purpose of writing is communication. Meanwhile, she'd praise other students for insights that I'd literally made in class discussions weeks earlier. When Noah Fox wrote about the symbolism of the green light in Gatsby, she called it a fresh perspective and asked him to share it with the class. I'd made the exact same point during our Gatsby unit, connecting it to the broader theme of unattainable dreams and the corruption of hope in modern America. She'd dismissed it then as reading too much into a simple image. During one particularly painful session, she handed back a practice essay on Hamlet. Mine was covered in red ink like it had been attacked by an angry pen. This is exactly what what I mean, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're trying too hard to sound smart instead of actually being smart. The essay was about Hamlet's delay and moral paralysis. I'd connected it to modern psychological concepts of decision fatigue and moral injury, drawing parallels between Hamlet's hesitation and contemporary understanding of trauma responses. I'd spent hours researching the psychological literature to make sure my connections were valid and meaningful. Apparently that was trying too hard. Ava Kim, sitting next to me, got hers back with minimal corrections and a note at the top. Excellent insight into Hamlet's character development. Her thesis was that Hamlet was sad because his dad died, and that's why he acted weird throughout the play. Her supporting evidence was that death makes people do crazy things, and revenge is bad because it hurts people. I went home that night and read my essay again. Then I read Ava's, which she'd left on her desk and forgotten to take home. Mine had more sophisticated vocabulary, stronger textual evidence, deeper analysis, and what I thought was genuine insight into the psychological complexity of Shakespeare's most famous character. Hers read like a middle school book report with better spelling. But hers got praise. Mine got humiliation. Something was definitely wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. I started wondering if maybe I really was overcomplicating things. If maybe my previous teachers had just been easy graders who'd inflated my confidence beyond what my abilities actually deserved. The pattern continued through October. Every essay came back worse than the last, each one decorated with increasingly harsh comments that felt more personal than professional. My paper on Victorian literature, a topic I'd been passionate about since discovering Jane Austen in 8th grade, came back with a D and a note saying I'd completely missed the historical context and social significance of the works. I'd written about how Victorian novels reflected changing attitudes toward women's independence and social mobility, using examples from Bronte, Eliot, and Gaskell. I'd researched the social conditions of the time, the legal restrictions on women, the economic factors that shaped marriage and career options. I'd even found contemporary reviews and criticisms to support my arguments. Ms. Delgado's feedback suggested I hadn't understood any of it. Surface-level observations dressed up in fancy language, she'd written. This reads like you copied from Wikipedia rather than engaging with the actual texts. Meanwhile, Marcus's Victorian literature essay, which argued that old books are boring but probably meant something to people back then, earned a C+ in praise for its honest engagement with the material. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Maybe I was overreacting. That's what I told myself anyway. Maybe my writing really had gotten worse. Maybe I was coasting on past success and needed to step up my game. Maybe Ms. Delgado was the first teacher brave enough to give me honest feedback instead of the inflated grades I'd gotten used to. When I mentioned the grades to Dad over dinner one night, he seemed supportive but not particularly concerned. Ms. Delgado has high standards, he said, cutting into his meatloaf. Maybe she's pushing you because she sees your potential. Sometimes the teachers who challenge us the most are the ones who help us grow. His response felt rehearsed, like he'd thought about this conversation before, but I was too wrapped up in my own problems to notice the odd tone in his voice or the way he seemed to know more about Ms. Delgado's teaching philosophy than a parent typically would. My guidance counselor said basically the same thing when I stopped by her office during lunch. Sometimes teachers are harder on students they believe in, Mrs. Rivera explained, barely looking up from the college brochures she was organizing. It sounds like she's challenging you to reach a higher level. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But my grades are tanking, I protested. I've never gotten D's in English before. Never. Well, you've never taken AP English before either, she pointed out. Maybe your previous teachers were just easy graders. Maybe this is what your work actually deserves when it's held to real standards. The words stung because part of me was starting to believe they might be true. Even my friends weren't particularly sympathetic when I tried to talk about what was happening. At least you're not failing, Chloe said when I complained about another C+ during lunch. Besides, everyone knows Delgado is impossible. Just survive until graduation and forget about it. But what if I can't get into college with these grades? I asked. There are lots of colleges, she replied with a shrug. You don't need to go to Harvard or whatever. Community college exists for a reason. Community college. The suggestion felt like a punch to the gut. I'd been planning to apply to 4-year universities, maybe even some competitive schools if I could keep my GPA up and write strong application essays. Now my best friend was suggesting I lower my expectations to the local 2-year program. Even worse was the response from my classmates. Word had somehow gotten around that I was struggling in Ms. Delgado's class, and people were starting to treat me differently. Kids who used to ask me for help with their own English assignments were suddenly too busy when I approached them. Study groups I'd been part of since sophomore year were mysteriously full when I tried to join. The message was clear. If Ms. Delgado thought I was a bad writer, then maybe I was a bad writer. And if I was a bad writer, what value did I have to offer anyone else? Everyone said it wasn't a big deal, but my GPA was tanking and my confidence was following right behind it. I'd started the year with hopes of getting into a decent college, maybe even with some merit aid if I could maintain my grades and test scores. Now I was watching those dreams slip away one red ink bloodbath at a time. The breaking point came in late October. We had to write a personal narrative, something I'd always been good at. I'd won awards for creative nonfiction, had pieces published in the regional high school literary magazine, and had always been told I had a natural voice for storytelling. I wrote about the summer I'd spent helping my grandfather restore his old pickup truck. It was a story about family legacy, about the value of patience and craftsmanship in a world that increasingly valued quick fixes and disposability. I wrote about how working on that truck had been our last real bonding experience before his death the previous spring, how he'd taught me that taking care of something old and broken was a form of love. I poured everything into that essay. Real emotion, genuine insight, careful attention to detail and pacing. I crafted it like a piece of art, revising and polishing until every word felt necessary and true. It was the kind of writing that had always earned me praise and recognition in the past. Ms. Delgado handed it back with a D and a note that made my stomach drop. This reads like you're trying to manipulate the reader's emotions. Authentic writing doesn't need cheap tricks. The overwrought sentimentality suggests you don't trust your actual experiences to be meaningful without artificial enhancement. Cheap tricks. Overwrought sentimentality. I'd written about my grandfather's death, about grief and love, and the ways we connect across generations through shared work and shared stories. Apparently, genuine emotion was a cheap trick. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the last line of her feedback. Consider focusing on experiences that feel more universal and less self-indulgent. Self-indulgent. My grief was self-indulgent. That afternoon, I was walking past the main office when I overheard something that stopped me in my tracks. Mrs. Rivera was talking to someone on the phone, her voice lower than usual but still audible through the partially open door. "I understand your concern about the grades," she was saying. "But without more concrete evidence of bias, our hands are tied. Teachers have discretion in their grading, and we can't override that discretion just because a parent is unhappy." There was a pause, then, "I know it's frustrating, Mr. Allen, but personal relationships between adults shouldn't automatically disqualify a teacher from—" She spotted me through the window and quickly ended the call. Mr. Allen, my dad. He'd been calling the school about my grades. Personal relationships between adults. My mind started racing. What personal relationship was she talking about? Why would Dad's concern about my grades be connected to some kind of adult relationship issue? But more importantly, why hadn't Dad told me he'd been calling the school? When I talked to him about my grades, he'd seemed supportive but not particularly concerned. He'd never mentioned taking any action on my behalf or having any conversations with school administrators. The pieces started clicking together in ways I didn't want to acknowledge, forming a picture I couldn't quite bring myself to see clearly yet. That night at dinner, I asked Dad directly, "Have you been calling the school about my grades?" He looked uncomfortable, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "I may have made a call or two, just to understand what's going on." "What did they tell you?" "The usual stuff. That you need to work harder, adjust your expectations, that kind of thing." He resumed eating, but his eyes stayed focused on his plate. "Why? Did someone say something to you?" "Mrs. Rivera mentioned something about personal relationships." "What did she mean by that?" Dad's face went pale. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. Then, "I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding going on." "What kind of misunderstanding?" "It's complicated," he said finally. "Adult stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But I was worrying about it. I was worrying about it a lot. The evasive answers, the uncomfortable silences, the mention of personal relationships. It all suggested something was going on that directly affected me, but that adults were determined to keep hidden. All I wanted was to pass AP English and keep my scholarship hopes alive. Somehow it was turning into a fight for my academic survival, with secrets and phone calls and personal relationships that adults wouldn't explain, but that seemed to be determining my future. The first clue seemed small, but hard to ignore. I decided to do some actual investigating instead of just feeling sorry for myself and hoping things would magically improve. I started by looking at the grades Ms. Delgado had given over the years. Our school district posted teacher statistics online. Average grades, pass rates, student feedback scores, that kind of thing. It was meant to be transparent, to help parents and students understand what to expect from different classes and teachers. Ms. Delgado's numbers had been consistent for the past 5 years. Class averages between B and B, roughly 15% A grades, about 10% D or below. Her student evaluation scores were solid, around 4.2 out of 5, with comments praising her knowledge and passion for literature, even when students complained about her tough grading standards. This year was dramatically different. Her class average had dropped to C+, with 25% of students getting D or below. Her evaluation scores had plummeted to 3.1, with multiple comments about unfair grading and personal bias, and seems to have favorites. Either this year's class was dramatically worse than previous years, which seemed unlikely given that most of us had been recommended for AP based on strong performance in previous English classes, or something else was going on that was affecting her teaching and grading practices. But here's what made it click. When I looked at the individual grades I could see through our online portal, there appeared to be a clear alphabetical pattern. Students whose names appeared early in the alphabet were getting normal Delgado grades. Students in the middle were doing okay. Students whose names came later, especially those in the second half, seemed to be getting lower scores consistently. My last name is Allen. I should have been in the front third of her gradebook, but my results looked like I was at the bottom. Too consistent to be a coincidence. I started paying attention to when she handed back papers. She'd always start at the front of the room and work her way back, calling names in alphabetical order. By the time she got to the S's and T's and W's, her comments seemed harsher, her grades lower, her body language more tense. It felt like she was getting frustrated or angry as she went, like each paper she'd already graded was putting her in a worse mood for the next one. But that didn't make complete sense either. Why would alphabetical order matter? Why would she be in a worse mood by the end of grading? Teachers usually graded papers all at once, at home or during planning periods. The order of handing them back shouldn't reflect the order of grading them or her emotional state while evaluating the work. Unless certain names were a trigger, mine included. Another clue made denial much harder. I needed to figure out what personal relationship Mrs. Rivera had been talking about when she'd thought no one was listening. The answer came from an unexpected source. My 8-year-old sister Lily. Lily went to the elementary school across town, but all the schools in our district shared the same newsletter. She was reading it at the kitchen table one morning, sounding out the bigger words and asking me to explain the parts she didn't understand. "Hey, isn't that your teacher?" she asked, pointing to a picture on page 3. The photo showed Ms. Delgado at a district charity event, standing next to a man who was bidding on a weekend getaway package. The caption read, "Local educator enjoys the evening with friend Mark Allen, who successfully bid on the amusement park package for his family." Mark Allen, my dad. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Dad was wearing the blue button-down I'd given him for Father's Day 2 months earlier. Ms. Delgado was laughing at something he'd said, her hand on his arm in a way that looked comfortable and familiar. They looked relaxed together. They looked like a couple. The charity event had been in May, right before school ended junior year, which meant they'd been seeing each other since at least then, possibly longer. And I was just now finding out about it through a random photo in a school newsletter. My mind started racing through conversations and interactions from the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. Had Dad mentioned going to the auction? Had he said anything about meeting new people or dating anyone? I couldn't remember him saying anything specific, but I realized he had been in a better mood last spring. He'd started dressing a little nicer, taking more care with his appearance. He'd been going out more on weekends, claiming he was meeting friends or attending work events. At the time, I'd been happy that he seemed to be getting his social life back together after the divorce. Mom had been gone for almost 2 years, and Dad had been pretty isolated, focused entirely on work and taking care of Lily and me. I'd thought it was healthy that he was finally making an effort effort to connect with other adults and build some kind of social network. I'd never imagined he was dating my teacher. That afternoon, I confronted Dad directly. He was in the garage, working on Lily's bike, when I showed him the newsletter photo. His face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, guilt, resignation, and then a kind of defensive anger. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though he had to know Lily had brought it home from school. "It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is that you've been dating my teacher and you never told me." He was quiet for a long moment, adjusting the bike chain with more focus than it really required. "Then, we went on a few dates over the summer. It didn't work out. We decided we were better as friends." "When did you decide that?" Another pause, longer this time. "Early September, right before school started." "Early September, right when my grades started tanking and my confidence began its downward spiral." "She doesn't even know you're my daughter," Dad added quickly, like that would make it better somehow. "I mean, Alan is a common name. It probably never came up in conversation, but it had to have come up. Teachers get class rosters with parent contact information at the beginning of every school year. She would have seen Mark Allen listed as my emergency contact. She would have seen his phone number and email address, the same information he would have given her when they were dating. She would have made the connection, especially after they'd been seeing each other all summer." "Did you tell her about me and Lily?" I asked. Dad's continued focus on the bike chain was answer enough. Of course he'd told her about us. We were his children, a major part of his life. If they were dating seriously enough to attend public events together, she would have known about his family situation. "So she knew," I pressed. "She knew you were my father from the beginning of the school year." "Look," he said finally, straightening up and wiping his hands on an old towel. "Adults have complicated relationships. Sometimes things don't work out the way we hope they will. That doesn't mean it has anything to do with your grades. My grades started falling right after you two broke up. Correlation isn't causation," he said, sounding like he was reciting something he'd learned in a corporate training seminar. "Maybe your grades started falling because AP English is harder than you expected. Maybe you need to take responsibility for your own academic performance instead of looking for someone else to blame." The words hit like a slap. My own father was suggesting that my academic struggles were my fault, that I was making excuses instead of facing reality. But I could see something in his eyes that suggested he didn't entirely believe what he was saying. There was guilt there, and worry, and something that looked like regret. "She's taking it out on me because she can't take it out on you," I said quietly. "That's ridiculous," Dad replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ms. Delgado is a professional. She wouldn't let personal issues affect her teaching." But he'd used her first name earlier in the conversation, I realized. When he'd talked about their relationship not working out, he'd called her by her first name like they were still close, like their connection was more personal than professional. "How long were you dating?" I asked. It wasn't serious. "How long, Dad?" Another pause. "Most of the summer, maybe longer." "How much longer?" "Since April, I think. Maybe March." He was looking at the floor now, unable to meet my eyes. "We met at a school event. The district was trying to get parents more involved, so they invited single parents to this social gathering. We started talking, and she seemed nice, and one thing led to another. Since March, they'd been dating for 6 months, not just a casual summer fling, and it had ended right before school started, right before I'd landed in her classroom for what was supposed to be the most important English class of my high school career." "What happened?" I asked. "Why did you break up?" Dad's face darkened. "She wanted things I wasn't ready to give her. She pushed too hard, too fast. Started talking about meeting you kids, about blending families, about taking the relationship to the next level. I told her I needed to slow down, and she didn't take it well." The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Ms. Delgado had been serious about my father, serious enough to plan a future with him, serious enough to want to become part of our family. And when he'd rejected that vision, she'd been left with a daily reminder of what she'd lost: his daughter, sitting in the front row of her AP English class. Then came a clue that ended any doubt about what was really happening. I needed proof that Ms. Delgado knew Dad was my father, and I needed evidence that their relationship had gone south in a way that might affect her professional judgment. The proof came from checking social media more thoroughly. Dad's relationship status had changed from single to "it's complicated" in June, then back to single in early September. Right around the same time, my grades took their dramatic nosedive. More importantly, I found Ms. Delgado's account under her first name. Photos of her and Dad at summer festivals around town. Check-ins at restaurants I knew Dad had been to because he'd mentioned trying new places. A post about excited for what the future holds in July with a heart react from Dad's account. There were posts about learning to be part of a blended family and looking forward to meeting his beautiful daughters. She'd been planning to be our stepmother. She'd been thinking about Lily and me as her future stepdaughters, imagining a life where she'd help raise us and be part of our daily routines. The posts painted a picture of someone who'd been deeply invested in a relationship that had ended badly, someone who'd had specific plans and expectations that had been crushed when my father decided he wasn't ready for the level of commitment she wanted. Then the post stopped abruptly. The last photo of her and Dad together was from late August, a selfie at some restaurant with a caption about celebrating new beginnings. After that, nothing. Radio silence on the relationship front. But there was one final post that made everything crystal clear. On September 3rd, the first week of school, she'd posted a quote: "Sometimes the people you trust most can hurt you the worst." Dad had liked the post. I screenshotted everything before it could disappear, creating a digital record of their relationship timeline and its connection to my academic struggles. Armed with this evidence, I finally understood what was happening. Ms. Delgado hadn't just been dating my father casually over the summer. She'd been serious enough to envision a future with our family, serious enough to post about it on social media, serious enough to start planning how she'd relate to his children. When Dad had ended things, apparently rejecting her vision of their blended family, she'd been left with a constant, daily reminder of what she'd lost. Every time she looked at me in class, she saw the daughter of the man who'd broken her heart. Every time she graded my papers, she was reminded of the family she thought she was going to join. And she appeared to be making me pay for my father's choices. That's when the blowback started, though I didn't realize it at first. I made the mistake of confiding in Chloe about what I'd discovered. Chloe, who'd been my friend since middle school and who I trusted completely. We'd shared everything over the years: crushes, family drama, academic stress, future plans. If anyone would understand the impossible situation I was in, I thought it would be her. I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, the grade patterns, the social media posts, the timeline of my father's relationship, and how somehow it aligned perfectly with my academic problems. Chloe listened to everything, looked at the screenshots on my phone, and then said something that completely floored me. So what? Teachers are allowed to date. It doesn't mean she's grading you unfairly. But look at the pattern. You're obsessing. Chloe cut me off. Maybe you're just not as good at writing as you think you are. Maybe this is what honest feedback looks like instead of the grade inflation you got from easier teachers. The words hit harder than any grade Ms. Delgado had given me. This was my best friend. Someone who'd read my writing for years and had always praised my talent. Someone who'd encouraged me to enter contests and apply for editor positions on the school newspaper. Besides, Chloe continued, everyone knows you've been struggling this semester. Maybe instead of making up conspiracy theories, you should focus on actually improving your work. Everyone knows. The phrase stuck with me. How did everyone know about my grades? I hadn't been talking about them with anyone except Chloe and my family, unless word was spreading through other channels, unless people were discussing my academic problems behind my back. I'm not making up conspiracy theories, I protested. I have evidence. You have coincidences and assumptions, Chloe replied firmly. Your dad dated your teacher, they broke up, and now you're looking for someone to blame for your bad grades. That's not evidence of bias. That's evidence that you can't handle criticism. The conversation ended with Chloe suggesting I talk to a counselor about my obsessive behavior and my tendency to blame others for my problems. She actually used those phrases, like she'd been discussing my mental state with someone else and had rehearsed her response. It got worse from there. Chloe must have shared our conversation with other people because suddenly I was getting weird looks in the hallway. During lunch, conversations would stop when I sat down at our usual table. People I'd been friendly with for years were suddenly too busy to hang out or help with homework. The Whisper network in high school is ruthlessly efficient. Within days, it seemed like everyone knew that I was struggling in Ms. Delgado's class and that I was blaming the teacher instead of taking responsibility for my own performance. The story had been filtered through multiple retellings, each version making me sound more unreasonable and delusional. Marcus was the first to say something directly. I was at my locker between classes when he approached me, looking uncomfortable but determined. I heard you're trying to get Delgado in trouble because you can't handle her grading, he said without preamble. That's not what's happening. My mom says parents who date teachers and then try to cause problems when it doesn't work out are the worst kind of people, he continued. Like, get over yourself and accept responsibility for your own failures. His mom. People were talking about this situation with their parents, which meant adults in the community were forming opinions about my family's personal business. The story had spread beyond school walls and into living rooms and dinner table conversations around town. It's not about the relationship, I tried to explain. It's about what seems like unfair grading. Right, Marcus said sarcastically. Your essays are suddenly worse than mine, and that's somehow the teacher's fault. Maybe you should consider that you're just not as smart as you thought you were. People I trusted took the other side without even hearing my full story. My lab partner in chemistry started requesting to work alone, claiming she worked better independently. Kids I'd known since elementary school were suddenly unavailable when I suggested studying together. The message was clear. I was being dramatic, vindictive, and probably delusional. Ms. Delgado was a respected teacher with years of experience and positive evaluations. My dad was just some divorced guy who couldn't handle rejection and was now trying to cause trouble for his ex-girlfriend through his daughter. Even adults were turning against me. When I tried to talk to my journalism teacher about what was happening, hoping she might understand since she knew my writing abilities from working on the school paper, she was polite but dismissive. Grade disputes happen, Mrs. Brooks said, not looking up from the article she was editing. But accusing a teacher of personal bias is serious. Are you sure you want to go down that path? I have evidence of what appears to be inconsistent grading. Do you? Or do you have suspicions and hurt feelings? She finally looked at me directly. Look, I know your writing is usually strong, but AP English is different. Maybe Ms. Delgado is seeing weaknesses in your work that previous teachers overlooked. Maybe this is an opportunity to grow instead of an excuse to blame others. Mrs. Rivera, my guidance counselor, was more direct when I requested a meeting. She called me into her office and strongly suggested I focus on improving my work rather than looking for external reasons for disappointing grades. But I have documentation of what seems like grading inconsistencies. Documentation of what exactly? That your father dated your teacher? That's not proof of unfair grading. That's proof of poor judgment on both their parts. But it doesn't mean your grades are wrong. She leaned forward across her desk, her expression serious. What it does mean is that you're in a difficult situation that requires maturity to handle. Making accusations about professional misconduct because of personal relationships is not mature. It's vindictive. I'm not being vindictive, I just want fair grading. Fair, according to whom? You? Your father, who might be feeling guilty about putting you in this situation? Mrs. Rivera shook her head. Teachers have discretion in their evaluation methods. Unless you can prove actual misconduct, not just grades you don't like, there's nothing anyone can do. I was being dismissed by the entire school system, and I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe I really was just a mediocre writer who'd gotten lucky in previous classes. Maybe Ms. Delgado was the first teacher brave enough to give me honest feedback instead of the inflated grades I'd gotten used to. Maybe my father's relationship really was irrelevant, and I was just looking for someone to blame for my own academic shortcomings. The doubt was worse than the bad grades. At least with the grades, I knew something felt wrong even if I couldn't prove it. With the doubt, I started questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and my abilities. But then November's progress reports came out, and the stakes became impossible to ignore. My first quarter grades had dropped my cumulative average to 2.8. For someone who'd maintained a 3.8 average for 2.5 years, this was catastrophic. The number felt like a judgment on everything I'd worked for since freshman year. The college prep counselor called me in for what she diplomatically called a reality check meeting. Mrs. O'Neill was usually encouraging and optimistic, the kind of counselor who helped students reach higher than they thought possible. But when I sat down in her office, her expression was grim. With these grades, you need to start looking at different types of schools, she said, sliding a pamphlet across the desk. Community college isn't the end of the world. You can always transfer after getting your basics out of the way. Community college, the same suggestion Chloe had made months earlier, except now it wasn't casual advice from a friend. It was official guidance from the person responsible for helping me plan my future. I'd been looking at four-year universities since sophomore year, researching programs and requirements, planning campus visits for the spring. I'd been considering small liberal arts arts schools that offered strong English programs and decent financial aid. I'd been dreaming about studying literature and creative writing at places that valued intellectual curiosity and academic achievement. Now I was being told to lower my expectations to the local 2-year program that specialized in job training and remedial education. What about the state university? I asked desperately. I know my grades dropped this semester, but if I can bring them up, the state university requires a 3.2 minimum GPA for admission, Mrs. O'Neill interrupted gently. Even if you got straight A's for the rest of junior year and all of senior year, you'd barely make that threshold. And that's assuming no further drops. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Let's say you get A's in everything except Ms. Delgado's class for the rest of the year. If you can pull your English grade up to a B average, you might end junior year with a 3.1. That would put you in range for some 4-year schools, but not competitive for any significant financial aid. Financial aid? The thing that would make college possible for someone whose dad worked as a maintenance supervisor and whose mom contributed exactly nothing to college expenses. What about merit scholarships? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Merit aid is competitive. A 3.1 GPA doesn't make you competitive. Mrs. O'Neill's voice was kind but firm. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you need to have realistic backup plans. The scholarship I'd been counting on, a merit-based award from the state university that would cover half my tuition, required maintaining a 3.5 GPA through senior year. I was now so far below that threshold that recovery seemed impossible. But it wasn't just about college anymore. My other teachers were starting to treat me differently, and my grades in other classes were beginning to slip as well. Word had gotten around about my grade dispute with Ms. Delgado, and suddenly I was the problem student, the kid who couldn't handle criticism, who blamed teachers for her own failures, who caused drama instead of doing the work. My history teacher, who'd always appreciated my class participation and thoughtful questions, started calling on me less frequently. When I'd raise my hand to contribute to discussions, she'd look right past me to someone else, as if my input was no longer valued or welcome. My math teacher began scrutinizing my homework more carefully than before. Problems I would have gotten partial credit for in the past were now marked completely wrong for minor computational errors or unclear handwriting. The benefit of the doubt that had always been extended to good students was no longer available to me. Even my art teacher, who'd always been supportive of my creative projects, started offering less feedback and encouragement. My self-portrait assignment, something I'd put weeks of work into, came back with a B and minimal comments, a stark contrast to the detailed critiques she usually provided. Now, it wasn't just my feelings or even my English grade, it was my entire academic future. Everything I'd worked for since freshman year was crumbling because one teacher appeared to have decided to take out her personal problems on me, and the system seemed designed to protect her rather than me. The worst part was how helpless I felt. Every time I tried to advocate for myself, I got branded as difficult, entitled, or delusional. Every piece of evidence I presented got dismissed as circumstantial or irrelevant. Meanwhile, my grades kept falling and my options kept shrinking with each passing week. Dad wasn't much help either. The few times I tried to talk to him about the situation, he got defensive and uncomfortable, like I was asking him to do something unreasonable. Maybe you should just focus on doing better work, he'd say, not meeting my eyes. Don't make this about me and Ms. Delgado. That's not fair to her. He still seemed to think he needed to protect her feelings, even though she appeared to be systematically destroying his daughter's academic future. His loyalty seemed divided in ways that made me question whether he really understood what was at stake for me. She's taking something out on me that has nothing to do with me, I told him one evening after another brutal day at school. That's not true, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Teachers are professionals. They don't let personal issues affect their work. Then explain the grades. Explain why essays that won contests in previous years are suddenly getting D's. Explain why students who can barely write a coherent paragraph are outperforming me. Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Then, maybe you're just not as good as you thought you were. The words hit like a physical blow. My own father was suggesting that my talent had been an illusion, that years of success and recognition had been undeserved, that Ms. Delgado was simply the first person brave enough to tell me the truth about my abilities. I was drowning, and the people who were supposed to throw me a life preserver were telling me to swim harder, or accept that maybe I deserved to sink. And then I found the one thing I wasn't supposed to see. It happened by accident, the way these things usually do. I was in Ms. Delgado's classroom after school, waiting for her to grab some copies, when something popped up that I wasn't supposed to see. I caught just enough to realize she and my dad were still in contact. It said she found having me in class challenging, like she thought I acted entitled and needed to be taught hard lessons about failure and rejection. She didn't just see me as another student, she saw me as an extension of my dad. And that changed everything. I had evidence now. Not just suspicious patterns, but what appeared to be a written acknowledgement that she was treating me differently because of her relationship with my father. But I also knew that going to the administration with information I saw pop up on her computer wouldn't be enough. I needed a different approach, one that didn't rely on evidence I wasn't supposed to have. I spent the weekend planning my strategy. I couldn't use the emails directly, but I could use the information in them to build a stronger case using legitimate methods. First, I went back through all my graded assignments and created a detailed comparison with other students' work. I asked classmates if I could look at their papers for study purposes, and documented what appeared to be clear differences in grading standards. Then I did something I should have done months earlier. I submitted one of my essays to external evaluation. The essay was the same Hamlet analysis that Ms. Delgado had given a D+ to, calling it overambitious and pretentious. I submitted it to the state writing contest exactly as I'd written it for her class. It placed second in the state. The contest results came with detailed feedback from judges, college professors, and professional writers who evaluated hundreds of submissions. Their comments praised the essay's sophisticated analysis, original insights, and mature understanding of complex themes. One judge specifically noted that my connection between Hamlet's psychological state and modern trauma theory was exceptionally well-researched and thoughtfully presented. Armed with this external validation and my documented evidence of what seemed like grading inconsistencies, I requested a meeting with the principal. I prepared for the meeting like it was the most important presentation of my life. I created a folder with copies of all my assignments, examples of other students' work, with names removed, and the certificate from the state writing contest. I went in calmer than I felt, carrying my folder of evidence and hoping that facts would speak louder than politics. Principal Fox was polite but skeptical when I explained why I was there. Grade disputes are tricky, he said. Teachers have a lot of discretion in their evaluation methods. I understand that, I replied, but I think there might be some personal bias affecting my grades. I led with the simplest truth. My essay had placed second in the state, but Ms. Delgado had given it a D+. That got his attention. Then I walked him through the grading patterns I documented, showing him what appeared to be clear inconsistencies in how standards were being applied. These seem like serious concerns, Principal Fox said when I finished. I know, I'm not making them lightly. He studied the state contest certificate for a long time. This essay really received a D+ in Ms. Delgado's class? Yes, sir. I can show you the original with her comments if you'd like. The meeting ended with Principal Fox promising to look into the situation. He asked me not to discuss it with other students while he investigated. 3 days later, I was called back to his office. I've reviewed your materials and spoken with Ms. Delgado, he began. I've also had the department head evaluate some of your essays without knowing whose they were. My stomach clenched. Anonymous evaluation could go either way. The department head's assessment was that your work deserves significantly higher grades than you've been receiving, he continued. There appears to be an inconsistency in grading standards. I held my breath. Ms. Delgado has acknowledged that she may have been overly harsh in her evaluations due to personal stress this semester. She's agreed to regrade your assignments from this semester using consistent standards. Regrading. It was something, but not everything. What about the personal conflict of interest, I asked. Principal Fox looked uncomfortable. Ms. Delgado has acknowledged that a personal relationship existed and should have been disclosed. Going forward, any potential conflicts of interest will be handled through proper channels. Translation. They knew something inappropriate had happened, but they were going to handle it quietly. The regrading process took 2 weeks. The department head reviewed all my assignments from the semester, and the results were dramatic. My D's became B+, my C's became AEs, my single B became an A. More importantly, I got real feedback for the first time in months. The department head's comments were detailed and constructive, pointing out specific strengths while suggesting concrete improvements. The grade changes raised my semester GPA significantly. My overall average climbed back to 3.4. Not perfect, but respectable enough to keep my college options open. More importantly, I got an apology. Sort of. Ms. Delgado asked me to stay after class one day in late November. She looked uncomfortable, like someone had required her to have this conversation. I want you to know that I've always had high expectations for my students, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Sometimes those expectations can come across as overly critical, and I realized that my feedback this semester may have been harsher than necessary. It wasn't a real apology. She didn't acknowledge the personal bias or take responsibility for the damage she'd caused, but it was acknowledgement that something had been wrong. I hope we can move forward professionally from here, she added. I hope so too, I replied, though I was already planning to transfer out of her class for second semester. It didn't look like TV justice. No dramatic confrontations, no public vindication, just quiet policy changes, grade corrections, and administrative damage control. But it was progress. My grades were back on track, my college prospects were salvaged, and I'd proven that students could advocate for themselves successfully, even when the system seemed designed to protect teachers. Here's what actually changed. The school implemented a new policy requiring teachers to disclose personal relationships that might create conflicts of interest with students or their families. Students were given more formal channels for appealing grades, and Ms. Delgado's future grade assignments had to be reviewed by the department head. Small changes, but significant ones for future students who might find themselves in similar situations. The bigger victory was personal. I'd learned that documentation matters more than emotion, that persistence pays off even when everyone tells you to give up, that adults don't automatically deserve the benefit of the doubt just because they have institutional authority. I also learned something painful about my father. Throughout the entire ordeal, he'd never apologized for putting me in that situation. When the dust settled, his main concern seemed to be whether Ms. Delgado was okay after the investigation. That taught me everything I needed to know about whose side he'd been on. I transferred to a different AP English class for the spring semester. My new teacher was demanding but fair. My first essay came back with a B+ and detailed constructive feedback. It felt like breathing again after months of holding my breath. Senior year applications went better than I'd dared to hope. My corrected junior year grades, combined with strong performance in other classes and the state writing contest recognition, made me competitive for several four-year universities. I got into 3 of my top choice colleges. The merit scholarship wasn't as generous as I'd originally hoped, but it was enough to make college affordable. Ms. Delgado left our school at the end of that year. I heard she'd accepted a position in another district. I never saw her again. My father and I repaired our relationship eventually, but it took time. The conversation that finally cleared the air happened the summer before I left for college. I'm sorry, he said while we were working in the garage. I should have told you about Ms. Delgado from the beginning. I should have ended it as soon as I knew you'd be in her class. It was the first time he'd acknowledged that his choices had damaged my life. We talked for a long time that day about boundaries and responsibilities. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave us a foundation for rebuilding trust. Lily, thankfully, seemed largely unaffected by the drama. She was young enough that Ms. Delgado's disappearance from our lives felt temporary rather than traumatic. As for me, I learned lessons that went far beyond academic advocacy. I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to be on your side aren't, and sometimes the only person you can count on to fight for you is yourself. I learned that institutions protect their own interests, that change happens quietly rather than dramatically, and that young people have more agency than they're often led to believe. College was everything I'd hoped it would be. My professors treated me like an adult capable of growth rather than a problem to be managed. My writing flourished in an environment where feedback was constructive rather than destructive. I majored in English with a focus on education policy, partly because of my experience with Ms. Delgado. My senior thesis was about conflicts of interest in educational settings, research that felt like a natural extension of my personal experience. I graduated summa cum laude with departmental honors. The same writing abilities that Ms. Delgado had tried to convince me were mediocre earned recognition at the college level from professors who had no personal investment in seeing me fail. After graduation, I worked for a nonprofit focused on education reform and student advocacy. The work was meaningful in ways that connected directly to my high school experience. A few years later, I heard that Ms. Delgado had left teaching entirely for some unknown reason. I felt vindicated, but also sad. It meant other students had suffered before the pattern was recognized. Looking back now, I'm grateful for the experience in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. It taught me resilience, advocacy skills, and the importance of standing up for myself even when it's uncomfortable. It also taught me that talent isn't fragile. It can survive unfair criticism and systematic attempts to undermine confidence, as long as you remember who you are. I still write, both professionally and personally. The voice that Ms. Delgado tried to silence by calling it pretentious found its place in the world despite her efforts. Today, when I work with students facing similar challenges, I teach them how to gather evidence, present their cases professionally, and persist through institutional resistance. But I also teach them that their worth isn't determined by biased evaluators, that talent can survive unfair criticism, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is prove your critics wrong by succeeding despite their efforts. A D+ can win state contests, as long as the right person is reading it.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop your favorite part in the comments. See you in the next one.